So Hans will allow you and your team go first, and then we'll switch over to Rafi and Ellie.
Great. Well, I think it should be the president of Termageddon to start us off. So Donata, go ahead.
So my name is Donata. I'm the president of Termageddon. I'm a licensed privacy and technology attorney, and I've been practicing in that field for about 5 years. I'm a certified information privacy professional, the newsletter editor for the American Bar Association's e-privacy committee, and the chair of the International Association of Privacy Professionals Chicago chapter.
My name is Hans. I don't have titles like that. I oversee partnerships and try to be the layman to translate what she engineers to, human form. So
very, very important.
I'm Ellie Friedman. A lot of people call me Eli because they thought it was a female's name, which is fine. You can call me whatever you'd like as long as there's an ELI there. And I'm the head of partnership success at accessiBe. I have over 10 years experience in Fortune 1000 companies from low tech to high tech, and now of course with accessiBe making the world accessible for all with our wonderful technology. Go ahead.
I'm Rafi. I run our strategic partnerships department. I have experience in finance and in blockchain, and very, very happy to help make the world a more accessible place.
And this truly is international because you guys are tuning in here from Israel. So thank you so much for being part of this here.
Oh, thank you very much for having us.
Fantastic. So let's all just dive right in. So in terms of web accessibility, can you all give me an overall picture of it and why it's so important?
Yeah. So web accessibility, it's been around for quite a long time. I mean, since the age of the internet. In the US, we'll say in 1990, the ADA was actually established, but that was really geared towards physical locations. And there was no verbiage, of course, for web accessibility at all at that time, since it was at the, the spawn of the internet. So it started actually becoming increasingly prevalent as time went on. And the advocacy groups and, of course, those that are from the disabled community started pushing towards creating a language that would be universal. So that's the WCAG guidelines. And those were established by the W3C, so the Worldwide Web Consortium. Up until today, it's been quite nebulous in the States. The rest of the world has had a better handle it, I should say. In Europe, in Israel, in 2015, it was established. So we're really pushing the bar and trying to make the world accessible for all with an automated solution versus the manual solution up until today, which has not been the most feasible way of doing it. And we can get into that, but that's kind of a bird's eye view of that if you want to jump in.
Yeah, and I think just to add in there to the end, sort of, more than 20% of the world's population, according to a lot of different research, has some form of disability. 26% of American adults have a disability, according to the CDC. So it's a much, much larger portion of the population than we like to believe a lot of the times, and it has a very significant business impact. And so while we are absolutely all about helping people with disabilities have equal rights and equal access like they should, we're also pointing out to business owners, hey, you're essentially locking this guy out of your store, and nobody should do that.
For sure. And you touched on some there, but I would love to hear from you, Hans and Donata. What are some of the problems that some businesses are currently doing right now that makes them not as accessible as, Rafi just touched right there?
Well, accessibility spans an array of requirements when it comes to what a website needs to provide. But one of the more popular items would be contrast with text against like background images. So maybe you have like the prettiest photo in the world, but it's like a very light photo, and you're using like white titles in front of that background image. That is an example of when you might not have enough contrast, where there's a group of people that can't even understand what your website is trying to say. And that's what accessibility is out to do. It's out to protect people, or it's out to create, a set of guidelines to help businesses or website operators properly display their information so that everyone can understand it and comprehend it.
Yeah, and I think in my opinion, way too many people say, all right, I'm too small of a business and this isn't going to affect me, or I'm not going to get sued because maybe I'm not a priority. And that's really not what we're seeing with accessibility because of private right of action, meaning that, people can sue businesses directly for violations. It's not just something that's enforced by the government. And even if you do focus on that portion of it and say, okay, well, I'll do this because of the law, I personally think that's a good way to look at it, but that's also the wrong way to look at it too, because just like Rafi said, you're alienating so many of your potential customers and you're losing business that way. And we see the same thing with privacy as well. People focus on the regulations and the laws and what they need to comply with, but they don't really think about, hey, how can I make this a better experience for my customers? So I think that's something that businesses should absolutely keep in mind when it comes to accessibility.
Mm-hmm.
Now you both have touched on different, abilities that viewers might have going to your website, but I'd love to hear more so on the international scope. So what are some, many of the members of our audience are US-based businesses. And so we kind of have, blinders on from what we're used to being experienced and exposed to. So I would love to hear, what are some common things you see needing some improvement in the areas to make it so it's more accessible for the international audience?
Sure. So actually, we did a research paper on this. We scanned more than 10 million web pages and posted our results. So we'll be happy to share the link to that after this, not right now. But we have a whole chart that shows, what are the most commonly inaccessible features. And it's surprising that a lot of them have to do with drop downs and pop-ups. Images, while they're something that a lot of us think about very frequently, about 50% of them are accessible. And that's actually a huge percentage because with most of the others, it's something like 98%. The problem with things like pop-ups and drop-downs not being accessible is that particularly with people who can't see, they would have no way of knowing that they've entered a pop-up. In some cases, I've heard from screen reader users that they've even had to shut down their computer and restart it to exit a web page. Not even exit a web page really, but exit the pop-up. And that's a terrible UI. And more importantly, for the business owner, that person is not going to come back and make a purchase.
Definitely. I would love to hear another example that you can think of, outside of that's a huge factor, though. I mean, it's even sometimes aggravating for people who have no visibility issues, too, if something isn't properly seamless with the website.
Absolutely. So one thing that we like to point out here, and I'm sorry, Ellie, one thing that we like to point out here is that sidewalk cuts that are used, that were initially intended for people in wheelchairs, they're now used most frequently by mothers with strollers. So there's a lot of accessibility features that end up just being really relevant to the community at large. So a lot of people who would prefer a larger font, a lot of people who want to look up a definition of a word. So there's a lot of adjustments that need to be made there. I'll let Ellie take a little bit more of the technical stuff.
Yeah, no, and also when it comes to localization, that's a big thing is when you're, especially if you're creating tech or content, it should have some type of localization embedded within it so that it can be, you can have a larger reach, first of all, for those that have difficulty in accessing the web to have the appropriate access to it. And just generally speaking, expanding your footprint business-wise, I think it's the wisest thing to do. In implementing a plan initially rather than having to reinvent the wheel or having to revamp thereafter. It's an incredible practice that we see a lot of companies actually having difficulty in, I guess, overcoming those issues later on rather than, of course, implementing them prior.
Absolutely. And just finally, on the specific issues, I want to raise the issue that 99% of websites in the United States have zero accessibility work done to them at all, unless it's something that their CMS automates. So for instance, a lot of CMSs automate ARIA labels on links and things like that. That's not because the developer really wanted to make that happen. The CMS does it automatically. So other than stuff like that, most US websites have absolutely nothing done. So I think it's almost a little bit misleading to point out just one or two things, because then people will go fix those one or two things and not look at the bigger problem.
Very true. And Hans and Donata, I would love to hear from you on how can US-based websites kind of expand the way that they look about their accessibility. How can obviously Rafi just touched. There's a whole slew of different common issues that websites aren't really fully inviting and welcoming all different kinds of audiences to their web space. How would you recommend a company to kind of even start deciding, okay, we need to make our website more accessible?
You can go ahead.
Yeah. That's exactly how it starts. It's business owners acknowledging that this is actually an issue for anyone who has an online presence, that accessibility is something that applies to you. And it is the acknowledgement of the problem that gets the conversation going. So I think it's that exact statement right there, which is how the next steps get figured out. And if it's like using a tool like accessiBe, or hiring developers to get their opinion on best practices. The fact is that if you're representing yourself online, you need to be doing it professionally. And as you enter into additional countries, accessibility is absolutely a part of the story in terms of how you enter new markets.
Now, Ellie briefly touched on it, but privacy is a huge part of your web presence online, making things accessible and making people being comfortable with entering your website and typing that information, or cookies and things like that. So I'd love to hear from you on, what are some of the privacy practices that brands and companies should keep in mind, especially within the international context?
Sure. So I think it all starts with where you do business. So if you do business in the United States, there are certain privacy laws that will apply to you. There's laws in California, Nevada, and Delaware. And the thing about privacy laws is they protect consumers, not businesses, which essentially means that they will apply to websites from other states. So if your business is not located in California, but you can get inquiries from California through your contact form, you might need to comply with those California laws. In the United States, we're seeing a huge grow in privacy right now. So there are over 23 proposed bills that various states have proposed right now that govern privacy policies on websites and privacy practices of businesses. So you do need to comply with those. But when you're moving out internationally, it's very important to understand that different countries have different privacy laws. Canada, Australia, UK, the EU, all have very, very strict privacy laws. And it's actually interesting to see that the privacy laws of different countries are enforced a lot more heavily than here. So even though we see fines and lawsuits here, we see hundreds of fines and lawsuits in the European Union for GDPR compliance. Mm-hmm. And, if you're thinking about going international, right now is the time to implement privacy compliance. Because the moment you start doing business in the European Union and you don't have a compliant privacy policy, that's the moment that you can be fined. And we've seen that with one-person companies or companies that violated the privacy rights of one person. So I think it's very important to remember that you need to make sure that, I'm sorry, the mailman came, we have dogs. And we're
no problem.
You shouldn't apologize for dogs. Never.
So, it's very important to remember that you need to be implementing privacy compliance now before you go into those other countries, before you start expanding your business into other states.
Definitely. I mean, there's a huge, just cost factor for that. So that alone is a reason enough to stress on that. But then also it just kind of sets the stage for your company to be up for success that way and to not have as many bumps along the road as you could have prevented.
Yes, if I may plug our services, but I will note there are competitors like us, so we're not the only ones. But what Termageddon is a privacy policy generator. And what we do is for $99 a year, we monitor privacy laws and then notify you and can even automatically update your policies when the laws change. Don't think we're special. There's many other privacy policies and generators in the world. Yes, I think we're the best, but the fact
I think you're special, huh?
Don't undersell your sweet. Come on.
But most importantly, we're here to educate people because we see time and time again business owners who have lots of plans for growth. Unfortunately, privacy laws can sometimes feel like an anchor holding them back from pushing into new markets. And we're hoping to we hope that services like ours can help them more confidently enter into new markets.
definitely take away the stress and just make sure you can dot the I's, cross the T's. And I want to encourage you all to get to know these people beyond the panel that we have right now. You have the expo section of this amazing platform, so you can connect more, learn more about these people's businesses, and continue the conversations beyond the panels. I see that we have some questions coming in, which is great. But first I want to ask, so you touched on a little bit on privacy laws. So I think sometimes people kind of forget that people care and countries care more so about their citizens' privacy. They're not concerned about your company. They're not concerned about, where your company is based, the headquarters are. They want to protect their citizens, their own assets, of course, which makes complete sense. But I think some people kind of get tunnel vision and forget about that. You really do need to consider all these different laws because they apply to you whether you like it or not. And I'd love to hear a little bit on why do companies need to, comply to the multiple privacy laws? And, obviously, working with teams and things like that helps with this. But I would love to hear you guys kind of express why this is so incredibly important.
Absolutely.
I think there's really two reasons why. Reason number one is fines and lawsuits. So violations of privacy laws can range from $2,500 per violation, meaning per website visitor whose privacy rights you infringed upon. So let's say you have 100 visitors from California per month. That is 2,500 times 100, which is a really high fine, especially for smaller businesses that are just starting out. And these fines can range up to 20 million euros in total or more. So it's definitely something that you don't want to mess around with. Certain states are providing the right for citizens to sue businesses directly. So for example, with the new California law, we've already seen 6 or 7 lawsuits because of inability to protect personal data or not disclosing properly who you share data with, which really, is very expensive to litigate a lawsuit, even if you win. And then reason number two, consumers care about privacy. So ever since the Cambridge Analytica scandal, that's really what propelled privacy, at least in the United States. So since that scandal, consumers have become a lot more interested in what happens to their personal information online. And there's been a lot of studies done showing that a large percentage of consumers will leave a particular platform or a website if they feel like their privacy is not being respected. So that means that a portion of your potential customers could just leave your website and go to a competitor if they feel like their privacy practices are better. And I think that's a very important thing to say when it comes to accessibility as well, right? So in accessibility, if somebody can't use your website, they will leave and they will go to a competitor who has a website that's accessible. Same thing with privacy. People will leave your website if they feel like you don't respect their privacy, and they will go to a competitor because they do care. So, people are reading privacy policies now, which was not a thing 3 or 4 years ago. It was just me reading them. But, that is changing. And I think that's a very important point to make.
And I'd like to speak about these privacy laws in general. I personally love the fact that human beings have a right to tell companies to get rid of your data, get rid of their data. That's pretty awesome. That's kind of a newfound thing. Human beings have a right to tell companies, edit my data, get rid of it, all that stuff. Exercising their rights is the formal way of saying it, I believe. Yes. I love that. I'll be the first to say it. I love that. But the fact is the challenge we as business owners will have is that as we enter into new markets and you start targeting different areas of the world, we are collecting that personal information of those citizens or residents of those countries, continents, whatever. And it is whenever you have a contact form or an e-commerce website, that means you are collecting that personal information the moment the user submits that data. And that's an example of when you may need to comply with those privacy laws. And that's why we suggest, work with a privacy attorney on finding the right solution for your business. Make sure your privacy attorney understands that they have to comply with multiple privacy laws if you're going international. Or you can use a tool like a generator of some kind.
Right. Yeah. And I think a very common misconception that people have is that you have to share the data or sell it for the privacy laws to apply. And that's not the case. All you need to do is collect it. And that's the point at which you need to start getting compliant.
That's a great distinction to make. Rafi, Elliot, what else would you like to add to this?
On privacy, as a personal matter, I very much agree with Hans. I think privacy is great. I am not a privacy expert, though, so if Elliot has any thoughts on this.
Nor am I, to be honest with you. This is the part where I'm really lacking, and I was waiting to be educated by Hans and Donata here. But I think it goes without saying that for too long, you know, corporations have had too much of a handle on, you know, our policy, and kind of just riffing off of what you said before. We have no idea where that's going or how it's being utilized. And now that we have these laws implemented, I think it's crucial for the next stage of our world, which is essentially the migration from the physical space into the digital space. We need to have a clear-cut definition as to what is privacy, what is accessibility, how is the new world going to affect the way that we conduct our lives, essentially.
To add in a little bit there, you know, I watched a lot of things that Andrew Yang said, and not to say anything about politics at all, one thing that I found really interesting was the idea of people monetizing their data, where sort of data is the new oil. And it's very true that, you know, the data from your phone can be a lot more valuable in some cases than even the job that you do, as at least on an economic side of things. Not to say that anybody's job is less important, but I think that that is a super important aspect of how we're going to be working with internet-based companies in the future, and how we'll continue to be able to do business like that, whether with disabilities or without. I think it could actually empower a lot of people who have disabilities to be sort of a greater force in the online world.
Definitely. I love hearing the full circle of the perspectives, and to get a little bit more nitty gritty of how we collect that information, you know, such as cookies and other tracking forms. I'd love to hear more from you, Donata and Hans. You know, can you speak more on that and what things that people, you know, companies need to be careful about with using things like cookies?
Sure. So certain countries have laws when it comes to consenting to the collection of data. They require consent to be able to collect data. So in the United States, we have the whole, you know, I give you the right disclosures and then you give me my data and you don't need to consent to anything. In the European Union and in Canada, that's actually different. So you have to obtain express consent. And that goes into cookies and into cookie pop-ups, which is a very confusing area for a lot of people. But if I can give any guidance here, it's that your website should only have non-essential cookies enabled by default if those laws apply to you. All other cookies you need to get consent for. And you need to get real consent. So no pre-check boxes, no only accept buttons, like you have to have a deny button as well. You know, you can't have a wall to access your website where you have to accept people, you have to just accept the website. You know, things like that. So you have to make sure that you make sure that you consent.
Yes, it sounds like this is an aspect where you especially shouldn't try to take any shortcuts. You need to make it crystal clear so that way you can cover your bases.
Yeah.
So, are we getting an echo right now?
Yeah.
A little bit. Yeah. A little bit.
All right. Maybe I'll just stop.
We're going to mute ourselves when we're not talking.
All right.
Sorry.
Oh, here we go. Okay, I think we're back to normal. Thumbs up.
Yeah, I think we might have just had a little glitch there. But, you know, I want to encourage you listening to the session, please type in some questions there. We have someone here from Madison. So thank you so much for submitting your question. So she asked, does accessiBe, so Hans and Rafi, offer a site language translation feature, or do you suggest merchants use native functionality of the platform they're on?
accessiBe can translate our own interface into 14 different languages. We can't translate the whole website, but we can translate the accessibility stuff into the language that you need.
And we do offer that in 14 different languages. We also have a very aggressive R&D department, so we're constantly adding new ones. We literally added 2 a couple months ago.
And flags also we're adding. So, you know, Canadian French is very different from regular French, so we're adding different flags for that. UK English is vastly different from American English. There are U's and different spellings of words, so we have to have a different flag for that as well.
Great. And Madison, I highly encourage you to go to the expo session so you can go to accessiBe so you can connect with them even further on this. And for everyone else, again, that all the partners we have here, all the speakers here, they are represented in the expo area of the booth so you can connect more beyond these panels. And Please roll in more questions about this. There's so much that we can cover this, but we want to give you as much content as possible in this little piece of time. So I want to first ask you, Hans and Donata, in terms of privacy areas, if there's only one thing that people can take away from this session, what do you think is the most important thing? What's kind of grinds your gears that you wish that companies were better about when it comes to their privacy?
I have mine. I don't know.
Okay, I can go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's probably going to be the same
Yeah,
thing.
probably will.
For me, it's if you're collecting personal information, you need to have a privacy policy. And personal information is any information that could identify someone. So, for example, name, email, or phone number. And these are things that are usually collected by websites through contact forms or newsletter sign-up forms. So just know if you have a contact form on your website, that's when you need to have a privacy policy. Is yours the same?
No, it wasn't.
Oh, wow, okay.
It was, but my one piece of advice is you have to have a strategy to stay up to date when new privacy laws go into effect. Because yes, privacy policies, at least to me, sorry, but they're like kind of boring. But they're there and they're important, and having a outdated privacy policy is just about as bad as having not one at all. And that's why I would say my biggest suggestion is establish some sort of strategy to be alerted when new privacy laws go into effect and when privacy policies require new disclosures, because that's what's going to help prevent you from getting fined or sued for privacy noncompliance.
So how do you recommend a company to go about making sure they're up to date? Do you think that should be, some people's teams' responsibility on it, or do you think it's kind of better to outsource it so that way they can just have someone giving the notifications to kind of almost automate the updates of the privacy policy?
Yeah. So if you have general counsel, ask them. Ask them for their opinion. Say, hey, some guy in a hoodie who told me there's a bunch of privacy laws that are coming and I'm in trouble, and see what general counsel has to say. My guess is that they'll say, yes, this is important, but I'm too busy for this. We need to find a solution. But maybe they'll say, no, I can take this on. Either way, you need to speak to an attorney. And best thing to do is, if you can afford it, is to hire a privacy attorney to monitor the privacy laws and update your policies when the laws change. There are alternatives. Termageddon is one of them, where we monitor privacy laws and push updates to our client policies when the laws change via our generator tool. So we're not a legal service provider, we're a technology company, and that's the con to using a generator like us is, the pro is you're not paying 25 grand a year. The con is, you're not getting legal services. You're getting a solution that, is used by thousands and thousands of people, but it's not a legal service provider.
And what do you recommend for companies that are on the super small scale who might, be watching this, be like, oh, shoot, I don't have a privacy policy right now in place? What do you recommend for those businesses?
I feel like you're just I would, of course, recommend Termageddon. I mean,
We would too.
I feel bad saying that because I don't want that to come off as salesy, but I think we have the most comprehensive generator in the world. We're the only generator out there whose founder is actually a licensed privacy attorney who happens to serve as the newsletter editor of the American Bar Association's e-privacy committee. So I think we're the only generator that actually has an attorney on staff even. I could be wrong, so please don't knock me if I'm wrong. Last I checked, though, from our competitors, that is the case. But yeah, I think look for a generator that provides great support, can walk you through the setup process and answer any questions you have, making you feel good about your solution if you are in a position where you can't afford a privacy attorney full-time.
Definitely. I think the big takeaway from that too, is you guys being one of the solutions, is that if you're a small company, it's probably best to delegate and invest in this, this piece of your business budget, so that way you can get it done quick, and just so you can kind of avoid those lawsuits, avoid all those, bigger costs, and getting down that, unfortunate rabbit hole. So thank you so much for sharing that. And now to dive more into accessibility, I'd love to hear from you, from Ellie and Rafi. Like, what are some of the things that you think are the most important takeaways when it comes to accessibility? What are some of the things that you guys see online and just kind of drive you nuts? I'm sure when you're putting together that research paper, there's so many things that made you want to roll your eyes and just close the computer, just think seriously, people.
There's a few. I think the biggest takeaway for anybody who's listening is your website probably isn't compliant. Your website is almost certainly not accessible to people with disabilities. And while your only solution is not accessiBe, there are a lot of free options out there to test your accessibility, to do a trial, to figure out sort of what your next steps are. And I would kind of go to what Hans said earlier, is the best thing that you can do is have a plan to implement web accessibility. Because, you know, I think we probably touched on a little bit earlier in that all of the accessibility is based on the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So it's the only internationally recognized set of guidelines. But in the US, the standard is reasonable effort. And the standard is also based on whether actual people with actual disabilities can use this website. And depending on advances in technology, different programming languages, whatever it may be, you may have to do other actions in order to become accessible. You may need to look into something. You may need to ask your lawyer some questions and say, hey, I heard this is updating. For instance, a lot of people in Canada now are double checking what their situation is because of the AODA coming into force in Ontario. So in my mind, the best thing that you can do is have a plan to make sure that you're going to be compliant in an ongoing way. And the last thing I'll say is that there is a lot of people who paid a lot of money for manual accessibility solutions, which I'm never going to knock. You know, a manual accessibility solution is an expert working very hard on a website to make it accessible to people with disabilities. That's a great thing. But it's going to take hours and hours and hours of a skilled person's time. That's going to cost tens of thousands. And then on top of that, every time you update the website, they have to update it as well. And a lot of people don't take that into consideration when they start one of these big projects, and they end up spending $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 still getting a lawsuit. The last presentation I gave outside the country, I was interrupted in the middle because somebody actually had to pay a $600,000 settlement, even after doing an accessibility project. So I think, yeah, that's about it for me. I'll pass it over to Ellie.
And also, along with that, I think that one of the biggest issues that we're facing is a lot of people know about ADA, but they don't know about the importance of ADA. And really what it comes down to is inclusion. It's an educational process that needs to occur. You know, with 1 in 5 people globally having some sort of disability, I mean, web accessibility is one out of many things that we need to make you know, our world more inclusive with. So I think one of the biggest takeaways is, of course, education is really having that strategy, as you know, we're all saying here, and actually doing something about it rather than waiting around and being a sitting duck and hoping that things don't happen just because of the law. I don't think that that should be the only driving force to becoming accessible or engaging in a privacy policy, you know, system or service. So I think it's just really educating your staff, being more open to learning about the disabled community and the hardships that they face on a day-to-day basis. They do have an especially difficult time, and even now during COVID especially, their access to local amenities are now severed, so their reliance on web accessibility is becoming even more so prevalent. They are more also prone to, per capita, they're more prone to you know, contracting coronavirus, especially during this time. So that's even forcing them even more. So they're exercising their human rights right now. So we're seeing an uptick in lawsuits and demand letters that are being served due to this. And I think that for good reason. Something needs to move the needle. That is both from the inclusive aspect, but also from the legal aspect. We need to institute an actual law that says WCAG is the de facto standard for web accessibility and needs to be enforced, just like it is here in Israel, just like it is in the UK, even though they're having their own hardships we'll get into. But on the more positive, I would say that, you know, it's the right thing to do first and foremost. Open up yourself to 2 billion people over, you know, worldwide. Uplift your brand reputation and value. And, you know.
Yeah, I would actually add on that. With today's atmosphere, let's say socially, advertising can be dangerous. A lot of companies stopped advertising. Doing a big announcement and telling everybody, hey, we're now accessible to all, there's nobody who can knock that type of advertisement. And it's also something that a lot of companies a lot of enterprise companies, Fortune 500 companies and so on, are integrating into their development process. So they're saying, We are going to make this part of how we do business going forward. We want to be accessible to everybody. And they're being very public about that. And I think it's very positive. The disabled community thinks it's very positive. On the whole, of course, you can't speak for everybody in a community. And I think that everybody else, everybody who's not in one of those communities, who might not have a family member with a disability or anything like that, sees that kind of thing in a very, very positive light. Because there's also, like we mentioned before, with the sidewalk cuts being, mostly used by people with strollers, I think it's the same here with accessibility. There's a lot of people aging into what I wouldn't call a disability, but they're a little forgetful. They might want to look up the definition of a word. They might want to make a font larger. There's a lot of things that just everyday people, mom and dad, might want to use.
Definitely. And I think the theme here is that it's important to, think of accessibility and privacy in terms of, for business, it makes sense for the bottom line anyways, and just, complying to laws, but it also it's the right thing to do. And, like you touched on, brand reputation is so huge. And it, when you're able to raise your business to these, beyond what the standards are, then you only create more positive outlooks and perspectives on your brand. And it just kind of welcomes and makes it even easier for people to want to refer your business, shoot over that, URL to a friend in an email or a text or something like that. Just make it as easy as possible for them to continue to share your services.
Absolutely. I think one thing I like to share with people is that I used to build websites for a living. And about 5 years, 5 years ago, there was something called having an SSL certificate to make sure your website is secure and safe and encrypted. And we looked at SSLs back then as like a nice thing to have, like, okay, yeah, it protects your website pretty much for e-commerce websites, not really anything else. Then Google said, hey, we're going to give better ranking exposure for websites that are secured with an SSL certificate. And that was kind of the front runner to where we live in a world now, where when we go to a website that says not safe, you don't feel safe. Like if you have a website,
you have to go to that website.
yeah, you feel like you're instantly uncomfortable. And I like to use that example to kind of share with you a thought experiment, which is think about where we're at 5 years from now. Companies like accessiBe, Termageddon, people who are trying to provide solutions to these spaces, well, not the companies themselves, but accessibility and privacy law compliance. 5 years from now, we're going to be looking at these times being like, remember when people were like kind of confused?
Yeah. They weren't sure whether they needed to be accessible, right?
Yeah, there were crazy people saying this stuff is important, and 5 years from now, we're going to look back at these times and think to ourselves, man, there's so much confusion and everything like that. But I think the same thing's going to happen 5 years from now. Everyone's going to have their solutions. Oh, you want an online presence where you're collecting the data of people? You need to be accessible. You need to comply with laws, and it's going to be that easy. So,
great point. Great point.
Definitely. And a couple questions that came in here for you, Ellie and Rafi. One, Ellie, John asked, what is the standard that you were referring to when you were just speaking a moment ago?
The WCAG guidelines. So it's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and right now it's at 2.1 AA, which is the standard for most websites that are out there, and that's essentially what our solution abides by, and that where most websites should actually be targeting when implementing a web accessibility solution into their website.
To touch on that really briefly, on the actual legality of it in the US, because I do think it is important to do it quickly. You have two laws that can apply in the US. You have Section 508 and the ADA. Section 508 only relates to government agencies and their direct suppliers. And then you have ADA that applies to everybody else. Unfortunately, ADA says you must make a reasonable effort to make your website accessible to people with disabilities. It does not anywhere say anything in the letter of the law, really, even about websites. In 2018, the DOJ released a ruling after many, many lawsuits with sort of unclear conclusions, saying that all business websites are places of public accommodations. It's a legal term. That means that they must be accessible to people with disabilities. Unfortunately, they still have not specified in the law a legal standard like the WCAG. That being said, in every settlement, every settled case that we've found, the injunctive relief portion of that settlement, which is what they're asking the defendant to do to resolve this issue, is comply with the WCAG 2.1 AA standards. And in section 508,
Right.
which is also US, it says specifically comply with WCAG 2.0 because when it was written, 2.1 wasn't available. So every other country goes with WCAG. The US goes with WCAG where it's clear enough to specify something. So we go with WCAG, and if there are new regulations, we'll hear about them and we'll be on top of it.
Awesome. And Hans shared a great resource in the chat box on how to do a privacy audit at mindsize.me. You can click on that URL. Rafi, Ellie, do you guys have a, a sort of way for people to kind of get a, an audit for how accessible their website is?
We absolutely do.
Yeah, we literally just developed, we just came out of the gate about 8 weeks ago with something called ACE, an extremely powerful tool, and it's an accessibility auditing tool. I'm actually going to write this in here if you would be so kind.
Perfect.
You keep talking, buddy.
You can literally place your domain name in there. It'll provide you with a compliance score. It'll also give you the technical reasoning as to where your website is compliant, and also some success points as to where your website might be actually compliant.
It'll give you code snapshots, snippets of what is correct and what isn't. We try to make it as detailed as possible.
And it's also a free service, so you can go ahead and tap into there. And of course, to reach out to us should you have any questions or concerns, we'd be more than happy to help you.
I have a question for you.
Yes, Hans, you over there in the back.
The man of the
Yeah.
Could one run this test and then implement accessiBe and then run the test again? And would that documentation help in any sort of lawsuit related that was pursued against them?
Sure. Let's touch on lawsuits because we actually have a whole process of how we handle those. We've had literally over 2,000 customers. We have like over 40,000 now, but 2,000 came to our door with papers already served to them where they'd gotten a demand letter and they, in general, had no idea they even needed to be compliant, immediately start searching for solutions, and they end up talking to us. Now, we're very proud and lucky to be able to remediate websites in 48 hours or less. Generally, when you receive a demand letter in most states, they're required to give you at least a 14-day remediation period. So if you get it within that time period, we're good to go. Because once we make you accessible, we'll send you a statement of accessibility. And if there's any kind of litigation procedure going on, which I would add, we've never actually had a client sued after installing accessiBe, so no issues there.
Knock on wood.
Yes, on the wooden desk. But
Compressed wood.
if anybody sends you a demand or a question, they're generally saying that something in particular on your website is not accessible. This form doesn't work, this doesn't work, this contrast isn't okay. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to audit it and make sure, hey, this is right. We took a video, we showed you it's correct. We're also going to send a whole bunch of documents. Happy to explain all of that a little bit later. Just don't want to waste too much time here. But we have a whole procedure we go through, and we have, I don't think we've ever had anybody progress beyond that.
Yeah.
We've never had any
Yes.
progress.
Thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom. I think people got a lot out of this. Again, please go to the expo section to connect with Termageddon and accessiBe even more. Obviously, they have great tools. They have a wealth of information, and please connect with them beyond this because we have the time. We're able to connect now. So thank you guys again for joining. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Megan, thank you so much. Really, we appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you. And all of you watching here, please head on to the next session, which will be covering vendor product onboarding and how it's unbroken and how to fix it more importantly. So see you guys in a moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.